Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest in InSync series of Ask the Expert. Today we are very fortunate to be joined by Reuben Cohn, Product Manager at Telestream. Hi Reuben, welcome.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
Reuben, many content providers are migrating their workflows to the cloud, but just as many really are hesitating. So what are the benefits of moving to a cloud workflow?
Sure. So there are many benefits. The first of which is really cost. So there tends to be a misconception that cloud is actually more expensive, but that is not the case. So when migrating to the cloud from your own data center, you kind of do away with the need to rent rent a facility, power the facility, all the ancillary equipment, connectivity, all the people you need to actually run the data center. You no longer have those costs. And so when you do move to the cloud, you just provision the pieces you need when you need it, and everything is running on commodity hardware. So you're actually spinning up nodes that are less expensive, and you only need to run them when you need to run them. So overall, you end up saving when it comes to the price of this system. And also flexibility is a huge benefit. So you really get the ability to quickly react to changes in your workload or workflow. When customer issues come up, they're quicker to resolve and you can work around them in different ways. You can also react better to equipment failure. Since it's not your equipment failing, you can fail over to another part of the data center, another machine. You can quickly get back up and running if something goes wrong. And you really have your choice of vendor, both for the cloud provider itself and the storage, as well as the different components you would use within your workflow. Uh, you can pick the vendor that works best for the piece of the workflow that you need, and use different vendors for different parts of your supply chain. So you do get better vendor choice. You can handle increases in volume, surprises in your volume much better. You can have confidence that when you do get a burst in demand or a large project comes along, that you can provision the hardware you need for that project. You no longer have to provision for maximum throughput. You can just provision for what you need at the time. So it's much more scalable. And so, yeah, there's lots of benefits in that regard. And like I was saying with hardware failover, disaster recovery becomes a lot more simple and straightforward. Instead of having essentially a backup data center or backup hardware with additional equipment that has to be tested and kept ready, you can really just use the built-in failover capabilities of the cloud providers themselves. So you can fail over to the rack next door, and really quickly be back up and running if hardware fails or if you need to move to another region. That becomes possible in the cloud, whereas on the ground, it's much more onerous when disaster strikes. So there are a number of benefits.
That sounds really good, but changing a complete workflow to a cloud solution can be quite complex, especially if you take into account the number and the range of processes that a customer is going to need to transfer. So what's a cloud migration like in practice?
Sure, you're right. It can be very complex. It can be more simple depending on what your workflow is like. But of course, if you have a large complex supply chain and a lot of different workflows with a lot of different decision making and different facilities, it can be quite complex. So of course, when a big entity is looking to switch over and migrate to the cloud, their executives and stakeholders really want assurance that at the end of the process, everything is going to be running smoothly, that everything is secure, that you do have the flexibility promised by the cloud. So, it all starts with a planning phase. You need to plan which pieces and components and workflows you are going to move to the cloud, which ones may stay on the ground, develop a plan for migrating different pieces and parts in the right order. So the planning phase is quite complex, but even once you start moving into the cloud, you have to select the cloud provider you're going to use for storage and compute, the different vendors you are going to use for your media processing. So obviously, customers want continuity in their workflows. So when you're switching to the cloud, you don't want to have to revalidate everything on a new set of components, new supply chain. So having companies like Telestream and InSync, where we can essentially run very similar or the same components on the ground versus in the cloud is actually a huge benefit. So Telestream Cloud offers hybrid solutions. So we can run our Vantage software on the ground. You can also use that same software in the cloud. So you can really bridge the gap between your on-prem systems and cloud systems to get that migration happening and make it smoother and have more confidence in the end results. So you do need to pick your vendors, system integrators. You may need to hire additional long-term staff that are cloud experts instead of on-prem video engineers. So there's sort of a different skill set needed for that. And you need to get sign off on the security and maintainability of the systems. So when everything's on-prem and in your own building, you have a lot more control of the files, the storage, keeping everything secure is sort of more well-known. When companies are moving to the cloud, there's always the fear that you're putting your content out on the internet and that must be inherently a bad or dangerous thing. And that is not the case. Of course, the cloud providers themselves have immense security protocols in place for both the storage and the networking surrounding the infrastructure you do spin up. And then each vendor is really responsible for maintaining that security through their systems as well. So Telestream Cloud and Telestream in general have robust security processes in place for this exact reason, to make sure that when a customer is looking at moving their really mission critical software, mission critical files up to the cloud, that it's all kept safe, even as they're being QC'd, transcoded, and delivered. So that's an important and sort of nerve-wracking part of the process. And then, of course, just changing the workflows themselves, in some cases, decision-making and logic that might have been run in software like Vantage or other on-prem software needs to be changed out and migrated to the cloud, which can involve changes in software development. So again, cloud experts may need to come on board to help design the functions that make those decisions, and then actually validating the solution. So a lot of testing is involved to make sure that, again, the supply chain is secure, you get the same end results and outcomes that you desire and were previously getting on-prem. So it can be complex if you do have a lot of workflows and a lot of things to move into the cloud.
One advantage of a cloud-based workflow is globally accessible signal processing. And here, in fact, I'm thinking of an old-fashioned standards converter that you could not use in New York and in London and in Singapore on the same day. But with the cloud, presumably there are a number of advantages for media companies, especially those who've got international audiences.
That's right. That's exactly right. So yeah, really, you can handle the data, the signals, the files where they're originating. So the various cloud providers have data centers in a number of regions close to where the files are originating or the signals are originating. And so at Telestream, we talk about it in terms of data gravity. You have all this very large data, these very large files. You don't want to have to move them around the globe to process them and move them back when it's done. You really want to process them where they originate. So with solutions like Telestream Cloud, you can spin up the compute next to the content wherever it may live. You might have a number of different locales where signals are originating, files are originating, and we can spin up the compute next to that storage in the same provider and data center that you're processing them in, so that you don't have to move these files. The media space is particularly bad when it comes to the size of files. Other businesses and entities don't have to worry about petabytes and petabytes of source content. Well, some do, but generally media is much bigger than other file types. So you don't want to, for example, have to egress your files around. In the cloud, you usually get a fairly significant charge for moving content out of the cloud provider and region it's in. So you really want to, and are incentivized to process it where it lives. So with a solution like, again, Telestream Cloud and the InSync technology, we can spin it up wherever it is needed. We can do the QC, transcoding, standards conversion, all in the cloud, in the provider and region where it currently lives, and then deploy it through the cloud to where it needs to be, either for delivery to the end customer or end entity, all within the cloud. So it really gives a lot more flexibility in terms of the regionality, and it lets you do the standards conversion where it lands, and then essentially egress or transmit only the deliverable, which is usually much smaller than the source content.
Mm. That does sound like a good benefit. You mentioned earlier, actually, one of the previous questions, you were talking a little bit about hybrid workflows, and some larger content providers, especially those with distributed workforces, have gone over to more hybrid workflows. Do you think that trend to hybrid is going to continue, or are customers going to move entirely into the cloud?
There really isn't a one size fits all option for migration. So I am certain that hybrid will continue to live on even in the larger entities. There is really still a need, in my opinion, for processing on-prem or essentially on the edge of the cloud, where let's say camera cards are coming into the facility, you may well need to process them on-prem first, just to maybe do a rough cut of the content, make sure that everything is correct using an on-prem system, which has more direct access to the physical camera cards, perhaps other equipment. Editing is still a bit more difficult in the cloud than on-prem. So I think it makes sense to at least start a cloud migration with a hybrid strategy in mind. Because in many or most cases, if you have existing workflows, existing infrastructure, you do want to keep using it for the time being, get the useful life out of the hardware and software you have purchased and are running on-prem. So certain functions should remain on-prem for the time being, may remain on-prem permanently. But again, as part of the cloud journey, it seems to make a lot of sense in many cases to start with hybrid, and then offload content, offload workflows to the cloud as they make sense or as your hardware ages out. And so some hybrid workflows really give you the best of both worlds. You can interact with the systems on the ground, your Avid workstations, all the hardware and people that you use on the ground. In some cases, you need to keep using that on the ground, either as you migrate entirely to the cloud or just begin the journey. So I definitely see it continuing for the time being, at least.
The other thing we've been hearing about are worldwide hardware shortages and component shortages. So, do you think that will accelerate the move to cloud-based processing?
Right. Yeah. I think it will. So to kind of tie back to one of the first points is one of the benefits of the cloud is cost. As people are weighing their options of what to do next, invest more in on-prem infrastructure or data center infrastructure, or move to the cloud. Shortages in hardware and components really changes that calculus, and it makes it more appealing to move to the cloud. Because of unpredictability like this, even if the prices aren't directly being affected right now, it shakes the confidence in the process of predictable pricing for your own on-prem infrastructure. So certainly there's a confidence level there. And also the large cloud providers have essentially more direct bulk access to purchasing hardware. And so you can really take advantage of the excess capacity in the data centers, let them absorb the increased cost of component scarcity. And if they end up passing the costs on to you, it's going to be less impactful than the costs involved in buying your own infrastructure when those costs do increase. And since the cloud providers are using commodity infrastructure, there's more of the types of chips being made that go into that than specialty hardware, one-off devices. And those one-off devices aren't always in use. You may have a specific appliance that you only use a few days a week, and the rest of the time it's idle. So when you're looking at, do I buy more of these one-off appliances or go to some flexible system like the cloud? Right now, that math already makes sense to go to the cloud in many cases. And as the on-prem hardware becomes more expensive, it will just drive more eyes and more focus onto the cost savings in the cloud. So yeah, I definitely think it will have an impact, and probably already is, as people are looking at the costs involved in this stuff.
Well, thank you very much, Reuben. There's some really good insights there, some really, really useful information. And I do appreciate the time you've spent to talk with InSync today. Thank you.
Of course, thank you for having me. It's been excellent.